It was the summer of 1940. The world was at war, and the night skies of Europe burned with searchlights and falling bombs. In England, German aircraft raided cities under the cover of darkness. The British Royal Air Force struggled to defend them because their fighter planes could not see in the dark. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the night, but by the time defenders spotted enemy bombers, it was often too late. The need for a true night fighter had become urgent. Across the Atlantic in California, a small company called the Northrop Aircraft Corporation was about to take on a challenge that no other company wanted. At the time, Northrop was barely 1 year old. It mostly built parts for other manufacturers and had never designed a combat aircraft from scratch. Larger and more established names like Lockheed, Grumman and Douglas were already overloaded with orders for fighters and bombers. Because they were busy, the new and relatively unknown Northrop Company got an extraordinary opportunity. In late 1940, the United States Army Air Corps and the British Royal Air Force jointly issued a request. They wanted an aircraft that could hunt enemy planes in total darkness without any help from searchlights or spotters on the ground. The requirements were ambitious. The new fighter had to climb high enough to reach bombers flying at great altitude, and it needed to stay airborne long enough to patrol large areas of sky. It had to carry enough firepower to bring down large, heavily armored bombers, and most importantly, it had to use a brand new invention that few pilots had ever seen before: airborne radar. Until then, radar had been operated only from the ground. Ground stations could detect incoming aircraft and radio their positions to defending fighters. But the new plan called for radar to be installed directly inside an aircraft. That would let the crew find and track enemies themselves in real time. It was a revolutionary idea, but also extremely difficult. Radar equipment in 1940 was bulky and delicate. It required large antennas, heavy power supplies, and operators who could interpret the strange signals on glowing screens. No fighter on Earth had ever been designed to carry such a device. In November of 1940, Northrop won the contract. The project received its name from its future victim. The aircraft would be called the Black Widow after the deadly spider that hunts in the dark. Work began immediately. Engineers and draftsmen filled the Northrop plant with drawings, models, and calculations. Their design was unusual, unlike any fighter of its time. The P-61 would be large, 50 feet long from nose to tail, and have a wingspan of 66 feet. That made it as big as some bombers, yet it would still be a fighter. Its body would consist of two long tail booms connected by a central crew compartment. The design was chosen to provide space for both engines, for the radar equipment in the nose, and for the crew of three: a pilot, a gunner, and a radar operator. For power, Northrop chose two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engines. Each engine produced twin horsepower and drove a three-bladed propeller more than 12 feet wide. With both engines running, the aircraft would reach speeds of more than 360 miles per hour, fast enough to chase down most enemy bombers. Inside the nose sat the most important part of the entire project, the radar. It was officially called the Airborne Intercept Radar, or AI radar. The system used a small rotating dish, 30 inches across, mounted behind a protective cover in the nose. It sent out short, sharp pulses of radio energy that bounced off anything in front of the aircraft. Those reflections appeared on a round screen in front of the radar operator as glowing dots. With practice, the operator could read the range and direction of an enemy aircraft, even in total darkness. He could then guide the pilot toward the target with voice commands: left turn, range decreasing, or steady on, prepare to fire. This was the first time in history that a plane could hunt another plane by radar. It no longer needed daylight or moonlight to see. The cockpit lighting was another innovation. Instead of the normal white lights that blinded pilots at night, the Black Widow used dim red illumination. Red light preserved night vision, letting the crew see both their instruments and the darkness outside. The P-61 carried serious firepower. In its belly were four 20mm Hispano cannons, capable of firing explosive shells that could rip a bomber apart. Above the fuselage was a remote-controlled turret holding 450 caliber Browning machine guns. This turret could rotate a full circle and elevate straight up. It could be aimed manually by the gunner or automatically by the radar operator. The pilot could also lock it to fire forward with his cannons. When all 8 guns fired together, the Black Widow delivered one of the most powerful bursts of any Allied fighter in the war. Its weight was enormous, more than 29,000 pounds when fully loaded with ammunition and fuel. The P-61 was not graceful, but it was deadly. It had tricycle landing gear, large flaps, and fuel tanks that held more than 600 gallons. Its range allowed it to patrol for hours at a time, circling quietly until radar found an intruder. To hide the aircraft from spotlights and searchlights, Northrop painted it in a new glossy black finish rather than the usual green or grey camouflage. Tests proved the black paint almost invisible in the night sky. When illuminated by searchlights during trials in Florida, the black aircraft went undetected in 80% of flights, while the lighter coloured one was visible almost immediately. From that point on, all P-61s were painted a deep, shining black, the same colour as the spider that gave them their name. Building the Black Widow was slow and complex. Radar was still secret, and engineers had to invent new wiring systems, cooling systems, and cockpit arrangements to fit everything inside. It took nearly 3 years before the first P-61 was ready for service. But when it finally appeared, it looked like something from another world, huge, black, and silent, with a long nose and twin tails stretching out behind glowing red exhausts. It was the first American aircraft designed from the beginning to fight in darkness. And soon, the shadow of the Black Widow would fall over every night sky where the Allies fought. By early 1944, the war had changed. Allied bombers filled the skies over Europe, striking factories, airfields, and rail lines deep inside Germany. But at night, the hunters became the hunted. German night fighters, guided by ground radar, stalked Allied bombers in the darkness. The United States Army Air Forces had finally received its own weapon for the night. After years of delay, the first operational P-61 Black Widows rolled off the Northrop assembly line in California. They looked unlike anything else in the sky. Huge twin booms stretched out behind the black fuselage, each ending in a tall vertical tail. The central pod that held the cockpit glowed faintly red inside, and the exhausts from the twin engines burned deep crimson. To enemy pilots looking up, it was as if a dark shadow moved among the stars. The first squadron to receive the new fighter in Europe was the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron. Their aircraft arrived in England on May 23, 1944. A few weeks later, the 425th Squadron received its own Black Widows. By then, the invasion of Normandy was only days away. Although both squadrons had their new aircraft, they arrived too late to join the D-Day landings on June 6th. Crews were still training on the radar systems and learning how to coordinate between pilot, gunner, and radar operator. The radar was revolutionary but not easy to master. In the dark cockpit, the radar operator sat behind a green glowing scope, calling out bearings and range to the pilot. Targets appeared as tiny blips on the screen, sometimes real, sometimes echoes of ground clutter or even birds. Then came the call every crew waited for: target in sight. A moment later, cannons roared, bright flashes tore through the night, and another enemy fell in flames. The Black Widow's first real combat mission came later that summer. Over the Mediterranean, P-61s were assigned to intercept the German V-1 Buzz bombs that roared toward Allied cities. Interception required perfect timing and sharp radar guidance. Although the P-61 was fast for its size, the V-1 was faster still. In many cases, the radar operators could only guide the pilots close enough to fire before the bomb crashed or ran out of fuel. By December 1944, Black Widows had reached several Allied night fighter squadrons. Among them were the 414th Squadron, the 422nd Squadron, and the 425th Squadron. They took part in the Battle of the Bulge, the desperate German counterattack in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major offensive of the war in Western Europe. The weather was brutal snow, fog, and freezing rain, perfect for night fighting. German aircraft used the poor visibility to launch surprise raids against Allied positions. The Black Widow crews rose to meet them. Night after night, they patrolled over the front lines, sometimes guided by radar, sometimes relying on flashes of light in the stormy sky. During one mission, Lieutenant Van Nieswinder piloted his Black Widow, nicknamed Daisy Me, against a German Messerschmitt 410 twin-engine fighter. They chased each other across the treetops, both aircraft pushing their limits. At full throttle, the German machine reached 400 miles per hour and managed to pull away. The encounter showed the P-61's biggest weakness despite its advanced radar and weapons: it was slower than the newest German fighters. Meanwhile, maintenance crews struggled with another challenge: spare parts. Northrop was still a small company, and production could not keep up with the demand for replacements. By late 1944, squadrons were cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft just to keep others flying. Yet the Black Widow earned respect among its crews. It was large and heavy, but it could take punishment. Pilots praised its stability, its heavy firepower, and the teamwork between pilot and radar operator that made it so deadly at night. In Europe, the aircraft's time was short. By the end of 1944, only a handful of missions remained to be flown there, but across the world, another front awaited one where the darkness still belonged to the enemy. In the Pacific, the war was entering its final phase. The United States had captured island after island, each one closer to Japan. But as the front moved west, Japanese aircraft launched relentless night raids on Allied bases and supply convoys. The Pacific needed a hunter that could see through the dark. The first to arrive was the 6th Night Fighter Squadron, which received its P-61s in May 1944. They were soon followed by the 418th and 419th Squadrons. A few weeks later, on July 1st, the 421st Squadron was activated, operating from airfields at Nadzab in New Guinea and Wake Island. For these crews, the Black Widow was more than a weapon. It was protection against an enemy that attacked without warning. On one of the first missions after receiving their new aircraft, Flight Lieutenant Owen Wolfe and Lieutenant Byron Elaine, his radar operator, were stationed near Owie Island. They were ordered to intercept an approaching Japanese bomber. Despite interference on their radar from heavy weather, Wolfe locked onto the target. Moments later, through breaks in the cloud, they saw the dark outline of a twin-engine Japanese bomber. Wolfe opened fire with all guns. The tracer round streaked into the night, and the enemy aircraft burst into flames, plunging into the ocean below. It was one of the first confirmed kills by a P-61 in the Pacific theatre. From then on, the Black Widow became a familiar sight at night across the Pacific Islands from New Guinea to the Philippines. Its radar eyes watched over Allied convoys and bases, hunting Japanese bombers that tried to strike under the cover of darkness. The aircraft's black paint, its glowing red exhaust, and the green shine of its radar screens gave the cockpit an eerie glow. Pilots said flying it felt like stepping into another world, a world of shadow and silence, where the enemy appeared as a single dot on a glowing screen. The Black Widow had finally found its element. It ruled the night skies, unseen but deadly, waiting for the next target to appear. By the middle of 1944, the Black Widow had become a steady presence across the Pacific. It was the guardian of the night, a hunter that stalked the skies above Allied airfields and convoys, watching for the glint of an approaching enemy bomber. The aircraft's massive radar dish saw farther than any pilot could with the naked eye. Its guns could tear through even the heaviest Japanese bombers. And in the dark, the black paint that gave the P-61 its name made it all but invisible. But despite its fearsome design, real combat was rare. By the time the Black Widow arrived in the Pacific, Japan's air power was already fading. Night attacks continued, but they were scattered, desperate, and often disorganized. For many pilots, patrols ended with nothing more than a long flight through empty skies. Still, when the Widow found its prey, the results were unforgettable. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron, based on Morotai Island in the Dutch East Indies, became one of the top-scoring Black Widow units. Its pilots called their aircraft by names like the Virgin Widow, Sleepy Time Gal, and Lady in the Dark. Each carried nose art painted in white or yellow on the deep black fuselage. In the months that followed, the squadron claimed 18 confirmed victories, including several of Japan's newest twin-engine fighters. In one night of fierce action, a single P-61 destroyed 3 Kawasaki Kai-61s, a record that stood for the rest of the war. The stories of these missions are filled with tension. Radar operators guided their pilots through moonless skies, watching small green dots slide across their scopes. The distance closed. The voices were calm, professional, and steady. Range 3 miles. Closing fast. Turn left 10 degrees. Contact 2 miles. Prepare to fire. The pilot leaned forward, peering into darkness, and then suddenly a shadow appeared ahead, moving against the faint shimmer of the clouds. He squeezed the trigger. The cannons barked in the night, the shells arced out, and the enemy aircraft exploded in a ball of flame that lit the sky for a brief, blinding instant. Then the darkness swallowed everything again. Only the radar screens glowed quietly, showing nothing but silence. At the same time, on the European front, the Black Widow was slowly giving way to faster, lighter aircraft. In the skies over France and Germany, the British Mosquito night fighter had proven faster and more adaptable. The P-61's size and weight, once its greatest strength, now made it slower than its rivals. But in the vast spaces of the Pacific, Where long range and heavy firepower mattered more than speed, the Widow still ruled. They were proud of the strange machine that had carried them safely through so many nights. Among all the Widows that flew, one would become legendary. Her name was Lady in the Dark, a P-61 belonging to the 418th Squadron. She was flown by Captain Lee Kendall with his radar operator Lieutenant Raymond Anderson. By August 1945, the war was nearly over. The atomic bombs had fallen, Japan was on the verge of surrender, and the skies were quiet. But for Kendall and Anderson, one last mission remained. On the night of August 14th, they were patrolling near the Japanese island of Aishima when their radar picked up a small contact. They closed in, slowly, cautiously, until the shape of a Japanese fighter appeared ahead. Kendall opened fire, his tracers lighting the night sky. The enemy aircraft tried to evade, but in its panic, it stalled and fell into the sea. It was the last confirmed air-to-air victory of the entire war. What happened next became one of aviation's most haunting stories. Less than 24 hours later, long after Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender, the same crew took off again. There were still isolated Japanese pilots who had not received the order to stop fighting. That night, they encountered another aircraft, a Nakajima Kai-44 Shoki, a Japanese army interceptor. As before, Kendall and Anderson maneuvered behind it, guns ready. But before Kendall could fire, the Japanese pilot dove sharply and crashed into the sea. Whether it was panic, exhaustion, or suicide, no one could say. Thus, the Lady in the Dark had scored not one, but two final victories, the first on the last night of the war, and the second on the first night of peace. The irony was not lost on the men who flew her. The P-61 had arrived too late to change the outcome of the war. It had spent years in development, only to see limited action once it finally reached the front. Yet in those few months of combat, it had done something remarkable. It had hunted in the darkness and won. Crews who flew it never forgot the eerie sensation of sitting in that black cockpit, surrounded by red and green lights, listening to the hum of the radar, and waiting for the next voice from the back seat to say, "Contact 2 miles." For them, the Black Widow was more than an aircraft. It was a machine that turned the night itself into a weapon. In total, the P-61 destroyed 127 enemy aircraft and 18 German V-1 Buzz bombs. It flew in every theatre of the Second World War, from the jungles of the Pacific to the skies of Europe and the icy Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And although it never achieved the fame of the Spitfire or the Mustang, the Black Widow carried a quiet legacy. It proved that radar and teamwork could conquer the night. Its design would influence a new generation of jet-powered night fighters and all-weather interceptors that followed. After the war, many of the surviving aircraft were used in scientific experiments. The most famous of these was Operation Thunderstorm, a joint project by the Army Air Forces, the Navy, the Weather Bureau, and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the organization that would later become NASA. Modified Black Widows flew directly into violent thunderclouds to collect data on turbulence, lightning, and air pressure. The research helped build the foundations of modern weather forecasting and aviation safety. By 1954, the last P-61 had been retired. Its black paint had faded, and its engines fell silent. But the legend remained a dark spider of the night that once prowled the skies, guided by the invisible eyes of radar, and that ended a world war with a final strike in the darkness. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in August 1945, the age of propeller-driven fighters was coming to an end. Jet engines were beginning to change everything, and radar had proven itself as one of the most important inventions in military history. Among the aircraft that bridged those two worlds stood the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, a dark, silent shape that had ruled the skies of night and storm. The Widow was both a masterpiece and a lesson in timing. It had been built for a need that existed in 1940, but it did not reach combat until 1944. By then, the enemy it had been designed to destroy was already crumbling. The aircraft that was meant to save cities during the Blitz arrived when those cities were already safe. Yet the Black Widow's influence would echo long after its missions ended. Its radar system, the airborne intercept, showed that technology could give pilots a new kind of vision, a way to see without light. The lessons learned from its use became the foundation for the radar and electronic systems that would define the next generation of fighters. The Widow had also proven the value of teamwork in the air. For the first time, an aircraft required 3 minds working as one pilot, gunner, and radar operator. Each depended on the others to survive. That cooperation became standard for the multi-crew interceptors and bombers that followed. Even after the war, the Black Widow continued to serve, In 1946, several P-61s were modified for Operation Thunderstorm, a joint research project between the Army Air Forces, the Navy, the United States Weather Bureau, and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which would later become NASA. The mission was both dangerous and groundbreaking. Crews were ordered to fly directly into thundercloud storms filled with lightning, turbulence, and ice to gather data that had never been recorded before. Instruments in the cockpit measured air pressure, humidity, wind speed, and electrical charge. The information they collected became the basis for the modern understanding of thunderstorms and how to avoid them. For pilots and scientists alike, the P-61 had once again turned the unknown into something that could be seen and measured. Another variant, the F-15 Reporter, was developed from the same airframe and used for photographic mapping after the war. It flew across the Pacific and over war-torn Asia, capturing detailed images of cities, mountains, and islands that had never been properly mapped. Even stripped of its guns, the Reporter carried the same elegant lines as its ancestor, quiet, purposeful, and always watching. By the early 1950s, newer jet-powered aircraft had replaced the Black Widow. Planes like the F-89 Scorpion and the F-94 Starfire carried faster engines and smaller, more powerful radar. They could intercept Soviet bombers at the edge of space, something the propeller-driven P-61 could never do. One by one, the remaining Widows were retired. Many were scrapped, their black skins cut apart for aluminum. A few found their way to museums, where they were preserved as reminders of a moment in history when darkness itself was an enemy to be fought. Today, only a handful of Black Widows survive. One of them, carefully restored, sits in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Another rests at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio. When you stand beside them, their size is surprising, almost as large as a medium bomber, yet shaped like a predator. Their surfaces gleam with a deep black finish that still absorbs the light. Visitors can see the cramped cockpit where 3 men once sat for hours, eyes straining against fatigue, guided only by the green glow of radar. Outside, the 4 long cannons beneath the fuselage remind us that for all its mystery, the Widow was a fighter. It was built to kill. In total, the P-61 destroyed 127 enemy aircraft and 18 of the German V-1 Buzz bombs. It flew in every major theater of the war, guarding the night over Europe, the Pacific, and even the remote Aleutian Islands of Alaska. But its true achievement was not the number of victories it scored. It was what it represented the moment when war entered the electronic age. Before the Widow, combat had always relied on what the human eye could see. After it, the battlefield belonged to machines that could sense the unseen radar, radio, and soon, guided missiles. The Black Widow was the first step toward the modern concept of stealth, the idea that invisibility and detection are weapons in their own right. For those who flew it, the P-61 was unforgettable. They remembered the steady heartbeat of its twin engines, the hum of the radar, and the way the aircraft seemed to vanish into the night the moment it left the runway. One pilot said later, "You did not fly the Widow. You joined her. She flew through the dark as if she owned it." Another described looking down from the cockpit and seeing nothing, only black ocean and cloud. Then, out of nowhere, the faint echo of another plane would appear on the radar screen, and the hunt would begin. That was the essence of the Black Widow: patience, precision, and a strike that came without warning. By 1954, the last Black Widow had been retired from service. Its engines were silent, its radar dark, and its name slowly faded from the headlines. But in the quiet hangars of museums and the memories of the men who flew it, the legend still lingers. The P-61 had arrived too late to change the course of the war, yet it left a mark that lasted far beyond it. It proved that technology and courage could conquer the night. It showed that even in total darkness, there are eyes that can still see. And in that sense, the Black Widow still rules the night, a silent shadow from another time, watching over the skies it once called home.